At 7 years old, Isabella of France was forced to marry Edward II. How did a child, a victim of a political alliance, become a vengeful queen capable of overthrowing her own husband? Discover her shocking story. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a thing. Imagine Isabel, a girl of barely 7 years old, surrounded by unimaginable luxuries. You see her growing up in the heart of the French court, a royal princess bathed in silk and gold. Her days are filled with elegant balls, etiquette lessons, and the constant murmur of the nobility around her. A world of privilege, where every whim becomes reality, without her yet suspecting the fate that awaits her. Despite her opulence, Elizabeth's childhood was not exempt from the rigidities of the court. You see her learning the intricate rules of royal etiquette, with lessons in dancing, music, and the history of her powerful family. Her education was designed to make her the perfect queen, a figure worthy of representing France on the international stage. But she was just a child. Remember how she played in the extensive palace gardens, surrounded by servants attentive to her every step. You imagine her sharing moments of innocence with her brothers and sisters, creating fleeting memories that would starkly contrast with the reality of her future. A life of childhood games and laughter before politics swallowed her up. But those days of innocence were numbered. In the heart of Paris, a treaty was being signed, a document that would seal your fate forever. The Treaty of Paris, a cold-blooded political transaction between kingdoms, made you a key player in a power game far larger than you. Your future, your very life, was being negotiated without your consent, without you being able to understand the implications of what was happening. In exchange for a strategic alliance, the promise of a fragile peace between France and England, your hand was offered as a pledge. You were promised a brilliant future, a life of luxury and grandeur alongside a king. But the reality was much bleaker. You were a small, innocent girl, about to be handed over to an unknown fate, to an arranged marriage that would define the rest of your days. No one thought of you, your desires, your fears. You were a bargaining chip, a tool to ensure political stability between two nations. Your innocence was sacrificed on the altar of royal ambition. At 7 years old, your life was no longer your own. The Treaty of Paris, that seemingly insignificant document, turned you into a betrothed princess, a future queen, and at the same time, a helpless victim of political gamesmanship. That treaty, signed with cold ink and boundless ambition, sealed your fate. You were leaving your home, the familiar warmth of the Parisian palace, headed for an unknown land, an English court that awaited you with suspicions hidden behind a facade of protocol. You imagined the journey. Endless days in a carriage, landscapes that slid blurrily before your eyes, the weight of the crown still too heavy for your small shoulders. The goodbye was a whirlwind of pent-up emotions. Hasty hugs, silent tears from your family, the echo of whispers that spoke of alliances and power, while you, just a child, absorbed the reality of your new life, an uncertain future that awaited you on the other side of the English Channel. Every familiar face slowly faded from the landscape, leaving a deep sadness in your heart. The sea, vast and gray, seemed to reflect the uncertainty that filled your soul. The journey was long and monotonous, the days blurred by the rocking of the boat and the monotony of the ocean. But even amidst that experience, your young spirit struggled to cling to hope, to a future you couldn't yet imagine, a future that, despite everything, could be yours. You arrived in England, little Elizabeth, a cold, gray country that contrasted sharply with the sunshine of France. The journey was long and tiring, but nothing compared to the weight of the responsibility you carried on your shoulders, that of uniting two kingdoms through an arranged marriage. You remember the imposing, cold, and dark cathedral, the scent of incense, and the expectant crowd. You felt small, insignificant, a piece on a political chessboard. Edward II, your future husband, was a young man, but his expression didn't reflect the joy or enthusiasm you might expect at a wedding. He seemed distant, absorbed in his own thoughts. The ceremony was long and confusing, filled with rituals and prayers you didn't understand. They placed you next to him, and he regarded you with an indifference that chilled your heart. There was no love, only a political union. After the ceremony, the opulence of the English court offered no comfort. The smiling faces of the courtiers seemed like masks, and the luxury of the palace halls seemed like a gilded cage. You felt alone, lost in a world of adults who used you as a political tool. Your childhood, stolen by the ambition of kings and queens, faded like the smoke of incense. Windsor Castle welcomed you with its cold stone walls. It was immense, a labyrinth of dark hallways and empty rooms that echoed with your loneliness. You felt small and insignificant in that place, far from your family, your language, everything you knew. The English language sounded strange to you, its customs seemed foreign, and the food. Oh, the food! It was so different from that in France that it sometimes made you cry with frustration. The food, the culture, the climate, everything was a challenge. Your only companions were the servants, people who, although kind, could not fill the emptiness you felt in your heart. You longed for the games in the French palace, the laughter of your siblings, the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. In England, sadness seemed to seep through every crack in the walls, covering everything with a deep melancholy. The days were the same, long and monotonous, between English classes and boring ceremonies you barely understood. Little by little, however, you began to adapt. You learned a few English words, albeit with difficulty. You carefully observed English customs, trying to imitate them in order to fit in. You clung to the small details that found solace in the monotony. A bird singing in the garden, a ray of sunshine penetrating the clouds, the kindness of a servant who gave you a smile. These were small moments that eased the heavy burden of your loneliness, small glimmers of hope in a world that seemed hostile and cold. Vast and solitary, childhood faded away. The cold walls of Windsor bore silent witness to your transformation. From a frightened child to an observant young woman, you learned to navigate the intricate rules of the English court, to read between the lines and understand the power play that surrounded you. The silence of the castle became your ally, a space where you could process the loneliness and humiliation you had suffered, where pain transformed into silent determination. The lessons in etiquette and protocol became weapons. You learned to use your beauty and intelligence as tools, not as objects of adornment. You observed the women of the court, analyzing their movements, their words, their strategies. You began to understand that your apparent fragility was a mask, that behind it lay a latent strength, waiting for its moment to blossom. Edward's contempt, his obsession with Gaveston and Despenser, marked you deeply, but they also strengthened you. You had to learn to survive, to protect yourself, to find allies in a hostile world. Humiliation became fuel for your ambition, pain a source of power. You were no longer just a child princess, but a woman ready to claim your place in the world, whatever the cost. The intrigues of the English court began to unravel around you. You watched, with a mixture of curiosity and fear, the growing influence of Piers Gaveston, a charming but ambitious man who became King Edward's favorite. His rise was meteoric, rising from a simple knight to a royal advisor, accumulating wealth and power by leaps and bounds. You, still a child, were beginning to understand the meaning of royal favoritism and the weight it could have on someone's life. Gaveston's ostentation and growing power caused you deep discomfort. His excesses and the king's open preference for him were evident to everyone at court. As you grew up, learning the intricacies of palace life, The contempt and humiliation became increasingly evident in Edward's actions. Your position as queen, far from being a symbol of power, became a constant reminder of your insignificance in your husband's eyes. The attention and privileges once accorded you vanished, replaced by silence and indifference. Gaveston, with his arrogance and disrespect, blatantly ignored you, making your life an increasingly lonely and frustrating existence. Your husband's disdain and the royal favorite's omnipresence were constant reminders of your powerlessness and the vulnerability of your position. Gaveston's growing influence became a constant shadow over your life. Edward, absorbed in his power games and the company of his favorite, relegated you to the background. The lavish parties and tournaments he held took place without your presence, as if you were a mere spectator in your own court. Royal affection, the attention of a husband, were a luxury denied you. Edward's disdain was palpable. He ignored you at official meetings, his gaze passing over you without the slightest acknowledgement. Conversations were monotonous. The few times you exchanged words with him, his responses were short and distant, as if your presence were a nuisance. The loneliness amidst the luxury ate away at you from within, a void that only the coldness of the castle stones seemed to fill. Your attempts to get her attention, to obtain a modicum of affection, were met with a wall of indifference. The letters you wrote her, full of innocence and hope, went unanswered. The carefully crafted gifts you gave her remained unopened. The mounting humiliation drove you toward a bitterness that grew with each passing day, sowing the seeds of future revenge. The humiliations were constant. You were relegated to the background while Edward indulged his whims with Gaveston. One day, while watching the court from a window, indignation flooded you. You were no longer just a child. You were a queen, and you deserved respect. Your patience had run out. You decided it was time to act. Your first confrontation was during a reception at the palace. Edward, surrounded by his favorites, pointedly ignored you. It was then that you stood up, with an imposing dignity that surprised everyone. Your voice, clear and firm, resonated throughout the great hall, reclaiming your position and denouncing your husband's disdain. The words echoed like thunder. You didn't apologize, nor did you retract your statement. You had openly defied your king, your husband, and his inner circle. The tension in the room was palpable. A deathly silence followed your speech. You had planted the seed of rebellion, a bold act that would mark a turning point in your life. Indignation turned to a burning hope with the birth of Edward, your firstborn. A little boy who, unlike you, seemed to have it all. He was the heir, the future king, a symbol of dynastic continuity. His arrival into the world was a ray of sunshine in the midst of the storm that was your marriage. At that moment, perhaps for the first time, you felt a true connection with Edward, not as king, but as the father of your child. A bond that, though weak at first, would grow stronger over the years. You looked at your son, small but with a latent strength, and thought about the future. A future that, until that moment, seemed dark and uncertain. But now, with Eduardo in your arms, you saw a possibility of change, a way to escape the humiliation and indifference of your husband. It was a fragile hope, yes, but a hope nonetheless. A small flame in the darkness of your marriage. Little Edward became your anchor, your reason for being. As you nursed him, as you rocked him, you dreamed of a different future. A future where he wouldn't suffer the same humiliation you had endured. A future where he would reign with justice and greatness. A future you yourself would help build, no matter the cost. That tiny being in your arms was your promise of revenge, the seed of your future power. But Edward's arrival didn't change the reality of your marriage. The court, a hotbed of intrigue, was further convulsed by the presence of Piers Gaveston, the king's favorite. His rise was meteoric, going from a simple knight to Earl of Cornwall, accumulating wealth and power at a dizzying pace. You, barely a teenager, watched with growing disgust as Gaveston became Edward's closest confidant, completely eclipsing the king. His influence on royal decisions was evident, and his arrogance was insulting even to the most powerful nobles. The tension at court was palpable. The traditionally powerful nobles felt relegated to the background by Gaveston's influence. Their privileges were threatened, their advice ignored. Resentment grew, fueling a climate of conspiracy and whispers. You, though young, sensed the imminent danger. The situation was explosive, and the growing rivalry between Gaveston and the barons affected you directly, as you felt the constant threat that this conflict could further destabilize your already precarious position. The royal favoritism was outrageous. Gaveston wielded power that was not his by right, spending the crown's money with abandon and flouting English traditions. His arrogant behavior, his lack of respect for the nobility, and his influence over the king were an affront to tradition and the stability of the kingdom. You, observing from your privileged but limited position, were beginning to understand that to survive in this power game, you would have to learn how to play it. The rivalry with Gaveston was not just a matter of personal pride. It was a fight for your survival and that of your son. His rise was meteoric, but it also provoked the ire of English nobles, who saw him as a threat to their power. You watched from a distance as tensions grew at court. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston was evident, relegating Elizabeth to the background, a child bride ignored amid the political turmoil. Opposition to Gaveston grew into open rebellion. The nobles, led by Edward's brother, rose up against the king, demanding the execution of their favorite. You witnessed the power of ambition and the cruelty of medieval politics, a world that engulfed you mercilessly. Gaveston, despite royal protection, was captured and executed. His fall was swift and brutal, a lesson to all those who dared to challenge the power of the English nobility. For you, it was a foretaste of what was to come, a glimpse into the instability and violence that defined your life. However, Gaveston's death did not bring peace. Tensions remained simmering, and the enmity between the king and his nobles only worsened. The nobles' victory was short-lived, only a brief respite before the next storm. Gaveston's fall had been a blow, but it hadn't prepared you for the arrival of Hugh Despenser. Younger, more ambitious, and with an even greater thirst for power than the previous royal favorite. You watched with growing unease as Edward II, blinded by adoration, elevated him to positions of immense power, completely ignoring the warnings of the nobility. The court became a silent battleground, where rancorous glances exchanged between the nobles and Despenser's supporters. The humiliation returned with a vengeance. Not only were you ignored by your husband, but Despenser and his supporters treated you with blatant disrespect, as if you were a mere figurehead, devoid of power and influence. Your attempts to intervene in state affairs were coldly rebuffed, and the growing oppression of the English nobility, now allied with your enemies, left you increasingly isolated. The situation was untenable. You, a princess, a queen, found yourself reduced to a mere spectator of your own misfortune. The court had become a gilded prison, where every day was a new affront to your dignity and position. But deep within your heart, a flame of rebellion was beginning to burn. You were no longer the innocent girl who had been taken to England, but a wounded and furious woman, ready to fight for her righteousness. Gaveston's fall had been a blow, but under Hugh Despenser, things only got worse. This new royal favorite, even more ambitious than his predecessor, established a reign of terror. Imagine exorbitant taxes that ruined the nobility and common people. The kingdom's wealth flowed into the pockets of Despenser and his allies, while you and the others were plunged into misery. The kingdom plunged into a deep crisis. The administration was corrupted to the core, judges were bought off, and justice was twisted to favor the dispensers and their henchmen. You yourself could have witnessed how the law was applied arbitrarily, benefiting a few while the majority suffered. The oppression was total. The dispensers seized lands, castles, and any wealth that crossed their path. The nobility, humiliated and impoverished, watched helplessly as the kingdom was destroyed. For you, daily life became a constant struggle for survival, a fight against injustice and tyranny. With Dispenser consolidating his power, Elizabeth's humiliation became unbearable. It was no longer just Edward's indifference, but the royal favorite's open display of contempt. You see how, in secret, she begins to weave a web of alliances. It begins with her ladies-in-waiting, trusted women who share her frustration and growing thirst for revenge. They become her first confidants, the ears into which she whispers her plans for escape and her future. But Elizabeth needs more than whispers in a chamber. She needs royal power, and for that she needs powerful allies. Her secret letters, written in elegant but firm handwriting, travel to France, to her family. Remember that she is a princess, and although her marriage has been a failure, her royal blood still holds weight. She remembers her brother, her mother, her relatives. They are her only hope of breaking the chains of her gilded prison. The response is not long in coming. It is not an open response, nor a declaration of war, but a veiled promise of support, a network of contacts stretching across the English Channel. French nobles, dissatisfied with English policy, see in Elizabeth an opportunity, a chance to destabilize Edward to gain ground and power. The Queen, isolated and humiliated, finds in them the echo of her own desire for revenge, the first building block for her future. The final straw was her public humiliation at court, in front of Dispenser and his henchmen. Imagine the Queen, the Princess of France, reduced to a mere object of ridicule. That day, something inside Elizabeth snapped. It wasn't just Edward's lack of respect. It was the deep wound to her pride, to her dignity. There was no turning back. The idea of escape, of seeking refuge, began to germinate in her mind, a spark of rebellion amidst the darkness. With the help of secret allies, Elizabeth planned her escape. It wasn't a simple escapade. It was an act of desperate courage. One dark and stormy night, taking advantage of the king's distraction, Elizabeth embarked on a clandestine journey to the continent. She left behind the opulence and squalor of the English court. An uncertain future awaited her, but the hope of freedom drove her forward. She carried with her the promise of revenge. Exile was a period of uncertainty and planning. In France, Elizabeth sought support among her family and former allies. She was not alone in her struggle. There, far from the shadow of Edward and Dispenser, she began to weave her web of conspiracies. Every meeting, every conversation, every promise sealed with a handshake was a step closer to her goal, the recovery of her dignity and the downfall of her husband. Exile was the crucible in which she forged her revenge. That day, something inside Elizabeth snapped. Humiliation was the spark that lit a flame of rebellion in her heart. In the midst of the oppressive and intrigue-filled English court, he appeared Roger Mortimer, a handsome, intelligent, and ambitious man, with a penetrating gaze that seemed to read your soul. He represented everything Edward II was not: strong, determined, and willing to challenge the established powers. For Elizabeth, he was a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. Mortimer, a nobleman exiled by the king, saw an opportunity in Elizabeth. A helpless queen, fed up with the abuse of her husband and her lover, Dispenser, he offered her his protection, his support, and, Above all, his comfort. Mortimer's attention was a balm for her wounded pride. Their conversations, initially cautious, soon turned into secret meetings, charged with palpable tension. Little by little, a dangerous alliance was forged between them. An alliance based on resentment, ambition, and a burning passion that transcended social conventions. Isabel, initially cautious, allowed herself to be swept away by Mortimer's charm, his promise of revenge, and his vision of a different future. She, the Princess of France, the humiliated queen, became a key player in a power play far greater than she had ever imagined. That man, Roger Mortimer, was everything Edward II was not: charismatic, bold, and with a thirst for power that matched her own. In initial whispers, in secret meetings in the palace gardens, Elizabeth laid out her plan. It would not be a simple escape, but a rebellion, a coup d'état that would return her to her place, but this time as queen, not as a prisoner. The first step: gaining the trust of the nobles disaffected with her husband's reign. The task was not easy. Many nobles doubted the ability of a woman, even a queen, to lead a rebellion. But Isabel, with her intelligence and innate charm, knew how to weave a web of alliances. She promised riches, power, and the promise of a just and prosperous reign, contrasting with Edward's corruption and despotism. Every secret meeting, every oath of loyalty, was a step closer to her goal. Meanwhile, Mortimer, with his military experience, was in charge of recruiting and training an army. Recruitment was slow and careful, selecting only those who shared his vision and his hatred of Edward II. Nightly meetings took place, plans were refined, and tension grew with each passing day. The conspiracy was like an hourglass, and the sand was quickly running out. From those furtive encounters, the idea of a conspiracy began to take shape, a bold plan that only a woman with Elizabeth's grudge could have conceived. The secret meeting took place in an abbey under the cover of night. Imagine flickering candles casting long shadows over tense faces, plotting in low voices, plotting the downfall of a king. Mortimer, with his natural charisma, convinced nobles dissatisfied with Edward's reign. There was simmering discontent, a buildup of resentment over excessive taxes and the king's ineptitude. Little by little, the idea of an armed uprising began to take shape, a secret and powerful army ready to challenge the king. Financing was the most complex part, but Isabel, with her connections at the French court and her own ingenuity, managed to raise the necessary funds. Remember, she was a princess, and her family didn't completely forget her. With the money secured, the recruitment of soldiers began secretly, in the shadows of the night, away from the king's prying eyes. Little by little, an army was formed, fueled by the promise of a new era, one without Edward II. The conspiracy was taking shape, an army ready to challenge the established power, an army with a wounded queen as its leader and an ambitious lover at her side. The moment of truth was approaching. Under the cover of night, the French fleet approached the English shores. You saw the coastline, dark and threatening, as the sails billowed in the wind, carrying Elizabeth and her army toward uncertainty. The air was thick with tension, the promise of battle hanging heavy in the air. It was the beginning of a civil war that would change the course of English history forever. The landing was stealthy, darkness their best ally. News of the landing spread like wildfire. Edward II, confident in his power, underestimated the threat. His arrogance blinded him. Forces loyal to the king mobilized, but Elizabeth's determination and the effectiveness of her strategy surprised many. The soldiers landed quickly and efficiently, ready to engage their opponent in a decisive battle. The conflict was about to begin. The first battle was brutal. Loyalties were divided, brother against brother, friend against friend. You witnessed the hand-to-hand combat, the clash of swords, and the war cry. Victory was not easily decided, but Elizabeth's strategy, guided by Mortimer, proved decisive. Little by little, Edward's forces gave ground, his once mighty army crumbling before the offensive. The collapse of the royal army was swift. Castle after castle fell into Elizabeth's hands. Civil war spread throughout the kingdom. Edward II's reign, once a symbol of power, was now crumbling before his wife's implacable determination. Elizabeth's victory seemed inevitable. Her revenge was about to be consummated. The English coast was approaching, and with it, the threat of battle. You saw Elizabeth's men, tired but determined, preparing for the clash. Boroughbridge, a place that would go down in history, loomed on the horizon, a stage for a crucial confrontation that would decide the future of England. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and the hum of military preparations. The tension was palpable, a mixture of fear and anticipation that ran down your spine. Edward II's army, loyal but outnumbered, awaited the attack. You watched the military formations, Elizabeth's strategy unfolding with precision. It was a deadly dance, a game of chess where every move counted. The battle began with a hail of arrows, the sound of steel against steel, war cries, and the thud of swords. Elizabeth's strategy, a bold and risky move, would take your breath away. The victory was crushing. You witnessed the defeat of Edward II loyalists, their ranks broken and scattered. Elizabeth's strategy had worked perfectly. The battlefield, once teeming with life and movement, now lay silent, littered with the dead and wounded. The triumph was hers, one step closer to the ultimate goal, dethroning her husband. The sound of silence after the battle, broken only by the moans of the wounded, echoed in your ears. Boroughbridge fell. Victory was yours, Elizabeth, but the real battle had just begun. Edward, your husband, was captured. I imagine the scene. The once powerful king, humiliated, led away like a prisoner. His eyes, full of disbelief, reflected the end of his reign, the end of his power. The humiliation he had inflicted on you was now returned to him in spades. The king's fall was a spectacle for all to see, a lesson for those who dared to underestimate you. His captivity was a slow agony. I imagine you watching from a distance, a complex feeling inside you. Revenge, perhaps, but also a strange sense of liberation. He, who had scorned you, who had ignored you, was now at your mercy. His days of luxury and excess were over. His power, his influence had faded. Only the echo of what once was remained. The end came swiftly, or perhaps with tortuous slowness. History whispers of a brutal murder, a final act of violence that marked the end of a reign and the beginning of a new era. But the truth, as always, remains hidden in the shadows of the past. A mystery surrounds the death of Edward II, a mystery that history, despite the centuries, has yet to fully solve. Only you, Elizabeth, truly know the truth of what happened. With Edward imprisoned, your attention turns to the dispensers. Hugh, the father, and his son, the king's favorite, were symbols of the oppression you had suffered for years. Their downfall was essential, not only to secure your position, but to satisfy the thirst for revenge that consumed you. The people's anger, fueled by your actions, became an unstoppable storm against them. The hunt began. Hugh, old and weary, was captured first. His trial was swift, brutal, a travesty of justice, but satisfying to you. Remember the humiliation you suffered. Remember young Despenser's insolence. Revenge was served cold, but effective. Hugh's execution was a public spectacle, a demonstration of your power. The younger, more elusive Despenser tried to flee, but his fate was sealed. They found him hiding, his arrogance broken, his power vanished. His death, just as violent as his father's, was the culmination of your plan, the end of an era of humiliation for you. His blood stained the land, sealing your victory, for now. With the Despensers defeated, Elizabeth's revenge was nearing its climax. Edward, your king, was a prisoner, his reign a sad memory of humiliation. The fall of the royal favorites had paved the way for the next act, an act that would forever seal Edward's fate and change the course of English history. The shadows of Berkeley Castle loomed over the monarch's uncertain future. It is said that death came in the form of a hot iron, inserted into his anus. A brutal, ignominious death, reflecting the merciless cruelty of his enemies. Others speak of a more silent murder, executed by expert and stealthy hands, but the cruelty of his end remains unchanged. The image of his agony has been etched into the collective memory of the era, an ending worthy of a medieval tragedy. The assassination of Edward II marked a turning point in your story. Elizabeth, the girl who had been given in marriage to consolidate a political alliance, had become the woman who had overthrown a king. Her ambition, her thirst for revenge, had transformed a victim into a powerful figure, although her reign would also be marked by controversy and instability. Edward's death was the end of one era, the beginning of another. With Edward imprisoned, the situation was in your hands. You were no longer just the scorned queen, the humiliated wife. Now, with the support of the army and Mortimer's influence, you became the central figure of power in England. Parliament, initially reluctant, bowed to your strength and determination. The fate of the nation rested on your shoulders, an immense responsibility, but also an unprecedented opportunity to change your own history and that of your kingdom. The regency granted you absolute power. You could appoint and dismiss your ministers, control the finances, and dictate the kingdom's policy. It was an exceptional situation, a radical change from the life of humiliation and contempt to which you had been subjected. The crown, symbol of your victory and the end of oppression, sat firmly on your head, gleaming in the candlelight. Your rise was meteoric. From victim to queen regent, the change was radical. The humiliation of the past faded, replaced by the respect, though sometimes mixed with fear, that now surrounded you. You had accomplished the unthinkable, overthrowing your own husband, a king, and seizing the reins of power. The weight of the crown, however, was immense. The future was uncertain, but for the first time you were in control. Now, with Edward behind bars, you, Elizabeth, were the true ruler of England. But you didn't reign alone. At your side stood Roger Mortimer, your lover, your advisor, and the man who pulled the strings of power from the shadows. His influence was immense, and his ambition insatiable. Every decision you made, every decree you signed, bore the indelible mark of his will. Mortimer surrounded himself with his own men, appointing his allies to key positions in the administration and the army. The nobility, accustomed to Edward's ineffectiveness, adapted to this new government, albeit with some suspicion. You, Isabel, allowed yourself to be swept away by the whirlwind of power, enjoying the freedom and influence you had never had before. But dependence on Mortimer was dangerous, a rope that tied you to him as much as it lifted you up. The joint reign, or rather Mortimer's rule through you, was characterized by a series of political and economic reforms. Alliances with France were strengthened, administrative improvements were attempted, and the power of the nobility was reined in. However, the shadow of corruption extended throughout the court, and the country's wealth flowed into the coffers of Mortimer and his allies, fueling growing dissatisfaction among the population. With Edward imprisoned, your reign began. Imagine the opulence. The finest fabrics, dazzling jewels, endless banquets and palaces that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Power flowed through your veins, But it wasn't the power of a legitimate queen, but rather usurped power, the bittersweet taste of revenge. Every luxury was an affront to the memory of your past humiliation, a symbol of your triumph over your oppressor. Feasts followed one after another, a dazzling display of wealth and power that eclipsed any other reign. Your lover, Roger Mortimer, was at your side at every celebration, his influence palpable in every decision. The court became a theater of intrigue, where royal favors were bought and sold as easily as silks and spices. But that opulence was a mask. Beneath the glittering surface, corruption spread like a disease. The royal coffers were being emptied at an alarming rate, lining the pockets of your allies and fueling your own extravagant lifestyle. The people, meanwhile, suffered under the weight of ever-increasing taxes, bitterly watching the ostentation of your court. But power, like honey, attracts flies. Your reign, though brilliant, was not without its shadows. The English nobles, accustomed to a weak and manipulated king, now found themselves overshadowed by the influence of Roger Mortimer. His power, exercised through you, was intolerable to them. Murmurs of discontent spread like a plague, whispered in the halls of palaces, in dark taverns, in the fields, a growing resentment that threatened to turn your crown into an unbearable burden. The powerful and proud barons were unwilling to tolerate the influence of a mere knight, even your lover. Mortimer, with his boundless ambition, had accumulated lands, titles, and riches at the expense of their loyalty. His enemies, increasingly numerous and powerful, began plotting in the shadows, seeking an opportunity to eliminate him and, with him, your reign. Conspiracies multiplied, alliances were forged and unraveled in a complex web of betrayals. The English nobility, divided between Mortimer's supporters and enemies, was preparing for a confrontation.